I'm talking today about reactive forms in Angular and how we can utilize their reactiveness. If you recognize this, this is me in the middle here. But in the summer, after I get some tan, it's not doesn't look anything like me right now. A little bit about myself. I love Angular, and I'm a trainer, consultant, and front-end developer. I'm also the founder of ngGirls, and these are photos from one of the recent events that we've had with ngGirls. If you want to support us and help us, then please talk to me. So let's dive right into reactive forms in Angular. So of course, we'll start with a demo. My use case is theater like this one, where the users can select their seats. Okay. Now, there are different types of seats. There are maybe seats for children or super comfy seats or other special types of seats. And they're marked with the different colors. And the seats that are already occupied are disabled and kind of grayish, like more transparent. And you can select a seat or a few of them, and there will be validation. For example, one of the validations will be asynchronous validation that checks whether the seat has been occupied in the meantime, and maybe you the client side hasn't received this data. You see that it updates all the time, but maybe it hasn't received this data about this seat yet. So like in this case, and then you'll get an error message. The seat will be unselected and disabled. Okay, and you can see that there are also seats that are released in the meantime. Let's see here. These seats were just released, and now we can select them. Okay, so this is my demo, and let's see how we use reactive forms and how to utilize the reactiveness of the forms. So just a little bit about the architecture idea behind it. Our first source of truth here is the room ID, which comes from the route, or the route parameters. We have the ID, we send it to the server, and we get back the data about the room. How many rows we have, how many seats in every row, what seat type we have, and basically this is the data that we get. Then we also get in real time the occupied seats or the released seats. Okay, it can be WebSocket or polling or however you like it. Now, when the user clicks on a seat, it asks the server whether the seat is occupied, and then we either say that it's okay or change it and disable it. And of course, we also save the selection in the end. Okay, so why do I use form here? Where is the form? Well, there is user input. Wherever the user selects, it's a user input. Okay, so it's like checkboxes. We have validation, the asynchronous validation, and we can add more validations. For example, whether the user has selected adjacent seats or has or is there a remained gap between the seats in one row, which is not okay. Then we can disable the occupied seats like we disable form controls. We can get data from the server and patch it or use it to build the form. And of course, we can submit the value in the end. So all of these things are easier when we're using the forms module. So why reactive? What's reactive about forms, and why do we want to use reactive programming? What is reactive programming anyway? Okay, that's a tough question that different people give different answers, sometimes very vague. But I found one resource, the Introduction to Reactive Programming You've Been Missing, and it has a really good introduction, and it tells us in one sentence what is reactive programming. It's programming with asynchronous data streams. And then you do things with it. You're looking at different things that maybe regularly you wouldn't think about them as asynchronous stream. For example, variables, data from the server that you've treated with promises before. You look at everything as a stream. And then you can do cool things with it. So you can have, for example, one source, one stream, but different listeners to it, and each listener will do something else. And the stream doesn't have to know, the source doesn't have to know who's subscribed to it. Okay, it's just doing a thing, and you can subscribe from different places and unsubscribe, and it won't affect each other. You have operators that you can use to change the value that you're getting in the stream, to filter it, and also to combine different streams together. So you can use the operator switch map, for example, for taking the value of one stream and then switching it to a different stream. Okay, and you can also merge streams together. So a lot of operators that can really help us in what we're trying to do. Now, I know there are a lot of operators, you've probably noticed, and it's hard to really understand and remember all of them, but you know that if you get familiar with something like 10 operators, that's plenty for you to start working with it. And also a big advantage of streams, of observables, that you can close the streams. You can either say that the stream has completed, or if you get an error, then it also stops, and you can also unsubscribe to a stream, okay? And then you prevent memory leaks. So how can we use these streams, the reactive programming, in reactive forms? How reactive actually are our reactive forms? So that's what we're going to see today in this presentation, where we have observables in the reactive forms in Angular, and how can we utilize RxJS from outside the forms module to use it with the forms. All right, so let's go back to our use case, and let's see where we're going to use reactive programming here. So first thing, we need to initialize the form, and we'll get initial data, and that's already an observable. Then we get the real-time data and disable the controls of the seats themselves. When we validate, we use async validators. There's also an observable there. And when we have the error, then we want to react in it, so we'll also use observables there. And also, we count how many seats the user has selected, and again, observables. So we initialize the form. Like I said, our source of truth is the route params, the route that the user has got into. We take, we have the activated route from Angular, and it gives us a lot of data, and one of them is the param map, which is an observable that gives us the current parameters that we have in this route. And so we subscribe to this observable, and we can get whatever parameters we have there. So what I'm doing here, I'm taking it and mapping it to get only the ID. I'm not subscribing to it yet because I don't know what I want to do with this ID. Then I want the room data. So I take the observable that I have for the ID, and I switch map to a method that I have on my database service to get the data from the server. Then when I get the data from the server, I can open another stream to create the form. So actually here, the form is also emitted as an event in the stream. And we can subscribe to it or use the async pipe in the component where we use the form. And then finally, we also have the room name that we want to display. And maybe it's not a part of the form. It's nowhere in the form controls. We just need the room name separately. So this also can be an observable that emits the room name that we have from the room data that we get from the server. Okay, so let's focus on the form itself. How do we construct it? We have the data, which is composed of rows, which it's an array of the rows, and each row is an array of the seats. So this is the seat control component. Of course, not the whole component, not everything is here, but the important stuff. So you can see that we implement the control value accessor to have the methods that the form needs to talk to this component in as a form control. And some of these methods are write value, which is called whenever the value changes, whenever the user puts their input, or whenever we set the value programmatically. And also set disabled state, which is something that we're going to use. So whenever we pass that this control is disabled, we can have some logic in here. And you can see that the template is pretty straightforward. It's just a button. It changes the color according to the seat type. It gets the disabled flag and changes the class, whether it's disabled and selected. Okay, so there's more here. Of course, you can see members like underscore value. These are private members that can be used when we use the setters and getters of the class. Okay, so how do we create the form? You probably all know this because in Angular, in most applications, we have forms, and you probably already used the forms library. So we have this method for creating the form, and we create a form group. The form group has rows. So the form group is for the whole form, and it has rows in there, which is a form array. And this array has another nested arrays inside for each row, and each row has so the nested array is of seat controls, and the seat controls are here. We create form controls with the information that we need. So in this case, the value that the user actually changes is only the selected value. But I wanted to have more information about the seat, and I decided to put it here with the value of the form control and not get it from an outer source, for example, from a service or as an input to this control, because it's more comfortable for me to have everything together in the control. And so whenever I need to get this data for validation, for example, I know that it's there in one place. Okay. You may choose to do this otherwise. And now we have this occupied false value there, but we actually don't really need it, because whenever the seat is occupied, we just disable it. And the disabled flag, we can get it from the form control. So how do we disable a seat if it's occupied? So when we create the form, if we get the data of the occupied seats, then we can right away set them here when we create the control by using, instead of passing to the form control only the value, we pass an object that contains the value and the disabled flag. So that's one option. But in our case, we get the data about occupied seats and released seats all the time, not only when we create the form. And we don't want to create the whole form or the whole control over and over again whenever we get this data. So how do we do that? So we use the observable that of the method that we're getting the data from the server, seats update observable. And it will give us 2 arrays of occupied and released, and each array has objects of the row ID and the seat ID. Okay, so we know which seats are occupied and which seats are released now. Okay, so we take the occupied seats, and then we need to get this seat. So in forms, we have the get method that we can pass to it a whole path to the control that we want, whether it's a form control or a form array or a form group. In this case, it's a form control. So we can pass to it the names of the form groups, or if we're using arrays with indexes, then we can pass the index itself as a variable. So that's really helpful. And once we have the control there, we can just disable it. Now, we can pass options to the disable methods, and I'm passing here emit event false, so that it won't propagate that we've changed anything here. Now, this will be used when we count the seats that we will see later on. The same thing for released. We get the released, we map it, we don't map it, we just iterate on it, and we get the control, and we enable it again without emitting the event. Now, you might think that maybe we can now, instead of doing it this way, disabling the control itself, maybe we can get the information and set or patch the values and disable it just the way that we created this control with the disabled flag. But the thing is, when you set a value, you don't have an option to pass this object with a value and disabled. You can pass only the value itself. And the same goes to patch value. So patch value and set value, when we're talking about a form control, they're implemented exactly the same way. They have different implementations when we're talking about form groups or form arrays. But for form controls, it's just the same. So also in patch value, we just don't have this option. But if you do want to use set value or patch value to catch the value, if you do have the member occupied or not on the value and you want to react to it, then you can listen to the set value change. It emits a change. So you actually subscribe to value changes that we have on the control or on the form. And whenever the value changes, whether the user has done this or it's programmatically, then this callback is called. Okay, so you can check whether the value is occupied and then set the control to disabled or enabled. Okay, but then you need to have the seat control here, so maybe you will use this method, subscribe to it, when you create the seat control. Validation. Okay, so whenever the user selects a seat, So I talked about two types of validation. One of a synchronous validation, that we check that there are no gaps in the row that the user has left. Okay. I'm not going to show too much of this validation, how to do this, but I want just to tell you a few things that you should know. Of course, you will have to write a custom validation for it. And there are two options that you can do this, because you want to validate the value against the whole row and not only one control. So you can create the validator either on the seat, on the control itself, or on the array control, on the form array. Pass a validator there. And then the control that it will get will have the value of the whole array. But if you choose to have this validation on the seat itself, so whenever the seat is selected, then it checks its row, then on the control you have the parent member, so you can access it to check the other values in this row. Okay, now let's go back to our async validation. Okay, so is the seat occupied? If it is occupied and we check it with the server, then we want to disable the seat. We also want to unselect the seat. And we want to show the error message. So let's start. How do we write our own custom validation? We write a function. A validator is just a function. It can be a factory function or it can be a regular function. So a factory function is a function that returns a function. And in this case, we're passing to the wrapper function, to the factory itself, we're passing some data, the room ID, the row ID, and seat ID, which we will need when we pass the question to the server. Okay? And the validator itself, it always gets the control, whether it's the form control, array control, abstract control. Okay? And this is the way you will use it. When you create the control, you will pass the async validators. And if it's a factory function, then you have to pass the parameters. So when we create the control, we have all this information, the row ID and the seat ID, and probably we also have the room ID from somewhere. Okay, and very important, you have to check whether the value is of the control is selected or not, because we want to do the asynchronous validation only if the seat is selected. If it's not selected, we don't care if it's occupied or not. Okay, so if it's not selected, just return null. But we're returning an observable here, so we return of null. If it is selected, then we're going to the database, we're checking whether it's occupied, passing the parameters, and we can pipe the event that we get, the data that we get, and see if we get that it is occupied, then we have to pass an error object, and if it's not occupied and everything is okay, then again we return null. Okay, so when we have this stream and we pipe to it, then it is already wrapped as an observable, so we don't have to return of null. Okay. So this is a factory function, but the thing is, it will create a function, a validator, for every seat control, and that's a lot of functions to have. And we can do this in a different way. We can pass a regular function. Okay. So if we're talking about validators that you may already know, required validator, it's a regular function, because it doesn't need any additional information. But validators like min size or min, max size, they get the number of what is the maximum value or maximum size that you need. And then it creates a validator with this value. But here we can get the room ID, row ID, and seat ID from somewhere else. We don't need to pass it when we're creating the control. And we don't need to have a different function for every seat control. Okay, so we get rid of that, and we have the control itself. Okay, so in the control we have the value of the row ID and the seat ID, right? Because I wanted to keep all the values there. And what about room ID? What about it? We have the observable for it. Remember that we got the room ID from the when we got the route parameters, and we fetched the data from the server, and then we created an observable with room ID. Actually, before we got the data from the server, even just from the route parameters. Okay, so we can use that and then switch map to the validator of the of whether the seat is occupied with the value inside. Okay. Now we want to react when there are errors. Okay. We want to show an error message and unselect the seat that has the error. Right. So the thing is, we don't have the errors object on the form itself. The errors object is only on the form control that has the error. And there isn't really a way in forms to just get whatever errors there are if you don't know the path to the control. So where should the logic be for that? There are different options. One is in the validator itself, but I think the validators shouldn't have how do you call it? They shouldn't have side effects. You can have this also on a service or a component somewhere kind of globally, or you can have the logic in the seat control itself, and that's what I did. And how do we get the error message? So what I did here is I created a subject for the error messages, and whenever there's an error, I just emit the error message there. So I have all the logic here with the seat control. When I create the seat control, if the status changes and it emits whether it's valid, invalid, and so on, then I get the errors of this control, and I have this here the logic where I can unselect it and disable this control. But then if I unselect the control, then it will immediately be valid again. So I don't want it to emit the valid status. So I filter only for the invalid, and it's my responsibility now to emit an event to the errors stream that it has to get away this error, to hide it. Okay, so I hide it after 5 seconds. Counting. So to count how many seats we're using, again, another subject. I subscribe to the changes. I pass either 1 or -1, whether it's selected or unselected. And then there's an operator that's like reduce, which scans the values and gives me the count. And this is why we need to the flag emit event false, so that it will not emit event when we disable seats that weren't selected. Okay? But when we disable a seat that is selected, we need to emit the event. We do want to count this to count down the selected seats. Okay, so just really quickly, there are some things you should know about forms. So register on change, it occurs only when you set value by yourself and not by the user. Register on disable change will emit every time there's an event, whether it's again the same event. So if you disable it twice, it will emit 2 events. And I hope you got some ideas here for how to use reactive programming with forms, with Angular. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to write to me and to talk to me in the roundtables today. So, thank you very much.